me begin. It is 2 p.m. in the afternoon. My name, of course, is, as you probably heard, Benjamin Franklin. If you would, I'd rather be referred to as Dr. Franklin. And I'm joined here with my good friend, Madame Briand, more on her later, all right? But before I begin, allow me to read a short passage from this, my autobiography, if you will, with the context of how we will present it today. Now imagine it may be equally agreeable to you to know the circumstances of my life, many of which are yet you are unacquainted with. I shall share them with you, to which I have, besides some other inducements, having emerged from the poverty and obscurity in which I was born and bred, to a state of affluence and some degree of reputation in the world, and having gone so far through life with a considerable share of happiness, the contributing means I made use of, and which, with the blessing of God, so well succeeded, future generations may like to know them, as they may find some of them suitable for their own situations and therefore fit to be imitated. However, I also confess that in doing so, perhaps I shall a good deal gratify my own vanity. Most people dislike vanity in others, whatever share they have of it themselves, but I give it fair quarter whenever I meet with it, being persuaded that it is often productive, if good to its possessor, and to others that they are within his sphere of action. Therefore, in many cases, I would not be quite assured if a man were to thank God for his vanity among the other comforts of life. Now, I will proceed to detail the events of my life using the words, phrases, and style of the present period, instead of that awkward, and some would say cumbersome style reflected in the prior quotation. So you may better understand me. But how have I learned your style of speech? Because I have spent many years among you, thanks to an invention of a friend that permits travel through time. This invention, which surpasses any of mine, is described in this book, authored by another friend, and I recommend it to you for, shall we say, edification in inventions of the ilk. I have not only learned much about these modern times, but I have also learned that I have continued as a very famous person. I.e., for example, as you note on this table, many of my images, very much like those that were reproduced in France during my period of sojourn there. And I've understood that once you have what they call a bobblehead, you've reached great popularity. There is my bobblehead, yes. All right, so I'm going to proceed again to give you a little bit about it. On occasion, should I violate the precept I just made, that I might in fact share with you some of my exact words to give better understanding, hopefully, to what I'm about to say. But let's talk about myself then, if you will. Obviously, I was a rather large man, 5'2", which I still am, stout as youth, but in good health. I was strong, for example. I could carry stacks of paper for the printing from one floor to the other when I was a printer's apprentice, if you will. I was a good swimmer. I actually thought of teaching swimming at one point, but decided it would not be a suitable way to earn a living. In later years, I was more sedentary and gained weight, developed gout and stones, but I believed in fresh air and took many air baths, of course. One has to do that. Sans one's clothes in order to get the best benefit, of course, of an air bath. You probably ought not to do it in a very public place, though. I recommend that. I might, for example, argue about how well I thought about the importance of air baths and ventilation. At one point when I was traveling with John Adams, poor John, we had a discussion about, of course, we were going to share the bed, but I also wanted to share the air by leaving the windows open, and he objected because they would somehow create some illness during the night, and I objected. We continued to discuss the issue, but of course, you realize that I won the argument. And again, I tended to improve my health generally by walking as a good exercise to improve my health. In terms of education, I was the youngest of 17 children of Joseph Franklin, a candle maker, who immigrated here from England to land in Boston. And we always used to joke about my father. He started out, of course, at one point back in England, his family were dyers of cloths, if you will. And he decided there wasn't a market for that in Boston, so he reverted to becoming a candle maker. But he never lost the fact that he was cheap with his candles, and we had very few of them in the house as a result. I received 2 years of formal education, if you will, in the local academy for young children. I was not good at math, but in myself, I began to educate myself after that by reading many books. In terms of my work, my father realized that I was not going to be a good candle maker. And so what he did is he apprenticed me to my brother James, who was in the printing business and printed a paper there in Boston. And I began to have the opportunity, of course, to listen to a number of gentlemen who would come and visit and have discussions about various topics at the time. I learned a lot from them. I also, of course, was privy to a number of books that they would provide or that were available. And in so doing, would copy the style of some of those books to learn how to write better. Because writing is an important part of being a printer, or if you will, also an editor of a newspaper. Now, at one point, I actually got to the point where I felt I was good enough to write a number of articles that I thought should be published in his newspaper. But of course, being a young apprentice and a younger brother, and subject to I admit, a bit of certainly verbal abuse and maybe even a little physical abuse, I found it unlikely that he was going to publish them. So I developed a style in which I created a number of stories representing a woman of the town, a widow. Her name was Silence Dogood, and wrote a number of articles which I shoved under the paper before everybody got up. And my brother and his friends read them and were astonished and began to publish them, of course, in his paper. As things progressed, my brother was taken aback and got into between, if you will, the local government of Boston, which of course was a religious-oriented government, and was critical of that government. And as a result, he was brought up before the administration, and it was determined that he should not be the editor of such newspaper. In which case, what he did, of course, is that he agreed that he would make me the editor of the newspaper, but in so doing, of course, I couldn't be an apprentice. So he developed a second agreement of apprenticeship, if you will, kept the other one destroyed the other one, and kept the other one that we kept in secret. I found that was a, shall we say, hypocrisy, which is unacceptable, where I was working as the editor, and yet he was getting the advantage of continuing to run the paper. And because basically of that, and because of the fact that my brother and I proceeded to part ways, as I said, primarily because of the abuse I received, I think in one way, in my experience with him, not only in terms of learning and writing and being able to write better than I had before, was also an appreciation of anger about the domineering individual, or if that matter, the domineering state that interfered with my rights as an individual. So I left. I became a criminal, if you will. I left Boston. I went down through New York and wound up in Philadelphia, where I began as a printer journeyman for Samuel Kamer. I lodged with John Reed of the town and began a relationship with his daughter, my future wife, Deborah. Now I might add, I'll read something about what I had read in written in my history here. I became, if you will, or made many erratic mistakes in early life. hard-to-govern passion of youth hurried me into frequent intrigues with low women, which involved some expense and great inconvenience, besides the continual risk to my health by a distemper that I dreaded, but through great luck, I escaped. However, during that period of time, my son William was born out of wedlock. I don't have to say about that. At that point, I was taken in by then Governor of Pennsylvania, who suggested that I should open my own print shop, and with his support, I should do so. But of course, to do so, I needed to go to England to acquire the necessary materials and facilities to open such a shop, and that he was going to help me in that endeavor, presumably financially as well as with contacts. And I proceeded to travel over to England. Along on the ship was Thomas Denham. He was a local merchant. And when I got there, I discovered that, in fact, there was the letters that I opened were simply letters of good wishes and good for and good luck. There was no financial support, nor were there any introductions to anyone who would have been able to help me and acquire that material. So I went to work in various print shops. I was admitted to London's coffee houses. I visited with scientific and literary and gentlemen in that particular environment. I was accepted not only because I suppose of my growing intellect, but my sense of humor, which has guided me through many years and many successes. At that time, I wrote something called the Dissertation on Liberty, and later on determined that it was wrong, and that I wanted to put it behind me, even to the extent that if I acquired copies, which I attempted to, would then burn them, because basically I was wrong in my thinking about vice versus virtue, I'm sorry. I returned to Philadelphia with the help of Merchant Denham. I went to work for him as his assistant and as a bookkeeper. He died, though, and I had to go to work again for Kramer. And at that point, I met Hugh Merrill, who was also working for him, and the two of us entered into a partnership to open our own printing shop. Now, excuse me. At this point, I'll just say, in the early part, basically what happened is the man, my partner, was not a good partner. He basically left. He went off to try farming. Through diligence, I was able to pay back his father, who was the one who actually contributed to our endeavor. And I began, of course, to enter into the business that I spent the next number of decades, and that is publishing a newspaper in Philadelphia. Now, what about my spiritual life? What about my religion? What about morals? Basically, some would say that I was a deist, but I determined later on in life, certainly after I wrote the dissertation, that I was not in such a deist at all, and that I was, if you will, more of something in between. It's a difficult thing to describe. I did not believe clearly in an organized religion, in the idea of revelation, but I believed in good works. I was involved in no particular religion, if you will, at the time. But that does not mean that I thought religion, if you will, unimportant. So I'll read to you a couple of precepts or letters that I had written. And one of them, by the way, I wrote to Madame Briand here while I was in Paris. And I was asking for her advice, shall we will, on a matter of conscience. And in a sense, it begins to acquire the ideas, and hopefully I'll elaborate more. But I began by saying, people commonly speak of 10 commandments. I have been taught there are 12. The first was increase and multiply and replenish the earth. The 12th is a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. it seems to me that they are a little misplaced, and that the last should be the first. However, I've never made any difficulty about that, but was always willing to obey them both whenever I had the opportunity. Pray tell me, my causius, whether my keeping religiously these two commandments, though not in the Decalogue, may not be acceptable in compensation for my breaking so often one of the 10, I mean that which forbids coveting my neighbor's wife, which I confess I break constantly, as often as I see or think of my lovely confessor. And I'm afraid I shall never be able to repent of the sin, even if I had the full possession of her. Now, I am consulting you upon a case of conscience. I will mention the opinion of a certain father of the church, which I find myself willing to adapt, though I'm not sure it is orthodox. It is this, that the most effectual way to get rid of a certain temptation is, as often as it returns, to comply with and satisfy it. Pray, instruct me, how shall I may venture to practice upon this principle? But why should I be so scrupulous when you have promised to absolve me of the future? But more specifically, a comment I made in discussing religious per se. I wrote, the main design and ultimate end of the Christian revelation, or of Christ's coming into the world, was to promote the practice of piety, goodness, virtue, and universal righteousness among mankind, or the practice of the moral duties, both with respect to God and man, and by these means to make us happy here and hereafter. And so what I'm basically saying is that whenever I saw, if you will, and it comes to interpretation of the scriptures, my main thrust was reason. Reason was, in my mind, what God gave us to use, and it may, in fact, be God in terms of exercising our reason. And so when it comes to scripture, that which makes good reason should be accepted. That which does not should be rejected. So that's basically my assumption when it comes to organized religions. I supported those who, for example, preachers, who would preach not the rules and roles of revelation and all the different precepts, but those who taught virtue amongst mankind. Because it was virtue that was not only important to the individual, but was important to society. To a free republic, we needed to have a virtuous people. And religion was an important part of that, because it taught those people the virtues they needed to, if you will, believe in their fellow mankind, and therefore believe themselves. And they should continue to examine themselves in terms of their participation in creating a public spirit, the idea of doing what is important for the good of mankind, for the good of the society, for the good of the community, not for the good of the self or of the party, but the good of all. And that's basically my religious precepts. I tried, of course, to examine my own virtues by developing, as I said, 13 different virtues. By the one, the 13th was humility, and I found that one to be the hardest, probably. But again, it's one of those that's very important for determining that kind of, if you will, public service and public concern that's important for a republic. Now, at this particular point in time, I entered into a common law marriage with Deborah Reed. And she took my son, William, into our household, and he became very much a part of our family. I did so because, of course, at the time when I left for England, I left her behind. She married, shall we say, a fellow, we'll not say whether he's a gentleman or not, who proceeded to leave her with debt. And of course, in order to avoid those debts, we, rather than enter into a formal marriage, we entered into a common law relationship to legally avoid those debts. We had 2 children, Francis, who died of smallpox at a very young age, and Sarah, or Sally as I say, who bore me 7 grandchildren. At that time, as a young man, again, I formed a junta to discuss morals and political and natural philosophy. Again, the theory being enter into society. We believe in mankind, we believe in our fellow mankind, and the best way we can develop a virtuous society and virtuous in ourselves is to examine ourselves with others, in community with others. So, for example, as a result, I also joined the Masons as a society in which we could continue our discussions of necessary precepts of virtue and public spiritedness. So therefore, as I said, I like religion that teaches a good and moral behavior necessary for democracy. My Puritan background, I think, taught me a bit about voluntarism, if you will. And that's why I thought we needed to encourage and like, if you will, others like, if you will, my good friend Jefferson, did not have trouble, if you will, with the deity of Christ. But as I said before, still believed in the goodness that he taught and the goodness that should be followed. During the middle years of 1920, yeah, I'm sorry, there we go, I've been in the modern world so long I don't know what year it is. In my middle years of 1726 to 1748, I had many accomplishments. I published the Pennsylvania Gazette, one of the most popular papers in the colonies, established the first subscription library in the colonies, of course published my Poor Richard's Almanack. I organized the first fire department in Philadelphia. Again, why? Because you needed firemen who came to the aid of others. Community, this is what we had to have. We had to develop that sense of public spirit. I was the postmaster of Philadelphia and deputy postmaster of the colonies. I designed a stove, appropriately named the Franklin stove. I became the clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly. I printed money for Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And I was the founder of the American Philosophical Society, in which we emphasized good work over clever words and action over theory and social endeavors. In 1748, I was doing so well that I retired. I retired from business, and I developed what you might call now the first franchise business. I entered into an agreement with David Hall in Philadelphia and others in other cities, whereby I provided them assistance with developing and opening a printing business, but then of course shared a certain amount of the profits of that business. I also led to the formation of the Pennsylvania militia, became a colonel, published the first political cartoon, as represented by this flag, Do or Die. It was done, of course, during the time of the French and Indian War, on which I attended the Albany Conference, which proposed unity of the colonies in order to protect ourselves against, at that point, our enemy being the French and their Indian allies. But of course, it was not only rejected by the colonies at that time, but by the British government. During the French and Indian War, I assisted British commander with supply, and of course, during that period of time, I developed my experimentation and observations with regard to electricity, which put me, shall we say, on the front page of many newspapers, both here in the colonies and in London. Other inventions I had during that period was the development of the lightning rod. I invented a damper for stoves, chimneys, a library chair, catheter, swim fins, daylight savings time, and a musical instrument called the harmonica, as well, as we say on the table over here, an instrument by which I could gather the books from the higher shelves without, of course, growing up the ladder. Very interesting little one. And of course, bifocals, but I can't find them. I'm not sure where I made it. I did this somewhere. But in all of these, of course, in all these inventions, I sought no patents. Again, my point being, I sought not the improvement of mankind and my community for myself alone, but for the community, that I share these technological changes in information with community to improve the community and not just myself. During this period of time, I was given honorary degrees from the Royal Society of London, Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, Oxford, and St. Andrews in Scotland. I was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly and helped establish the University of Pennsylvania and contributed to Franklin and Marshall College and introduced the first bill for a Pennsylvania hospital. During this time, we ran into an incident which you probably have heard about, and in this area, shall we say, some conflict with the policy of the British with regard to the frontier and the indigenous people who lived there, the Indians, if you will, the famous Paxton Boys, as they were called, concluded that, of course, they were not being given the kind of support they needed, probably as well from the Pennsylvania government as well as the British, and so decided that they were, shall we say, take things into their own hands and attacked a number of actually Christian Indians and massacred a number of them. They then were going to attack Philadelphia. The governor came to me, asked me to provide support to prevent them from sacking the city, if you will. I met with them outside of the city. We had a discussion. Basically, they agreed to dissipate, to go back to the frontier with expect a few who would meet with the governor. And I have to say that was a little undisturbed by this agreement and by this meeting, because not only did the governor agree to, shall we say, some of their terms, but he agreed to provide compensation for Indian scalps that might be acquired by these fellows. I tried to introduce a bill that would require the killing of Indians a capital offense, and unfortunately, as a reflection, I suppose, of the feelings of the time, it was not enforced, it was not voted up. Between 1752 and 1762, I became a representative of Pennsylvania and to the British government. And my goal there was to provide that the proprietors of Pennsylvania be required to provide support for the government by taxing their properties. And for that matter, to replace the then Thomas Penn, the successor to the famous Penn, as royal governor. I failed in the latter, but succeeded in having the Privy Council permit some taxation. I underestimate, however, the power in English society. I boarded with Margaret Stevenson and her daughter Polly, who became lifelong friends. And I might add, basically, that's exactly what we were. We were friends. Because at the time I was still married and would not, shall we say, go beyond the accepted cultural mores of the time. Basically, I made another trip to England between 1765 and 75 and represented both Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. During this time, the 1765 Stamp Act was put forth. And I almost lost my reputation because initially I thought I would argue that it might in fact be an acceptable external tax versus an immediate internal tax. And I'm not sure that distinction supported it, because therefore I found out that that would be a very unpopular position. I changed my position, if you will. I was brought before the Privy Council, and there's a publication up here that, shall we say, saved my reputation because it was circulated amongst the colony, in which, with the pro and con of being questioned by the House, I, of course, attacked the Stamp Act as being something that was unacceptable to the colonies. Then in 1773, an incident occurred that changed not only my life, but my perspective of my life and the colonies. A number of letters, I came into possession of a number of letters of the governor of Massachusetts named Hutchinson. It was my belief during this period of time, of course, that to be honest with you, I wanted to be an Englishman. I was an Englishman. I'd come, my relatives had come from England. I felt I was still an Englishman. I wanted to be a part of English society, and I wanted to, if you will, gather and become a part of the, if you will, the aristocracy of the people that I dealt with on a day-to-day basis. Those who were both in the political realm and in others. And what happened was that these letters became public. Basically, they were returned to Massachusetts and given to the Massachusetts legislature, who realized that basically their governor was proposing that they should be punished severely. And of course, they took umbrage at that suggestion. And then it became notified that these private letters were now being circulated and had been circulated by someone, and of course the finger was pointed at me. It may have been true, in fact. But in order to determine whether that was the case, I was ordered to come before the Privy Council in what they called the cockpit. It was a room in which, back in the, shall we say, earlier days, they did in fact have cockfights in this room. And I was severely tested and questioned by the then lawyer, if you will, we will call him today, for the British government. And I looked around, and while I was being chastised severely, disrespected verbally, all of the friends and the other men who I had dealt with on a day-to-day basis, and I thought I might like to become part of, were laughing at me. And at that point, I went in believing I was an Englishman, but I left as a patriot. And that was the change in my life. Another observation, though, before I get into what happened during the Revolutionary War or whatever, has a bit to do with the issue of slavery. And I have to admit I made some earlier mistakes. But like every man, I think over time we all change. We sometimes learn more, we change our perspective, maybe because we get older. But I had early on written the observations regarding the increase in mankind and held the belief that the Englishmen of the Enlightenment theory of the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. And of course, as a result of that, I developed, if you will, in my mind, some contradictions, some of which I guess I've necessarily resolved. For example, I began to be enamored, in a sense, with the American natives and the way they ran their lives and organized themselves. I found it somewhat intriguing. Yet, I must admit, I was fairly critical of my German brethren who lived in the city or the state of Pennsylvania. And to say the least, was a bit disparaging of them. Well, of course, why? Because they were different. They spoke a different language. They came from a different place. They weren't Englishmen. And so I developed a certain amount of prejudice against them. And at the time, when it came to, if you will now, black people or African Americans, as was indicated at the time, I believed in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. In other words, I was professing what you might call white supremacy. But over time, I changed. The first change came about when I got involved with supporting young children in different schools in different parts of the colonies. And I began to realize in observing these black children and these white children that they both had the same abilities in terms of their intellects and abilities and meanings. And I began to change my perspective. So although myself I owned some slaves, I proceeded to free those slaves. And I became involved in the anti-slavery movement in Pennsylvania. I wrote an article about the Somerset case, a famous one in which the British government decided that slavery, if you will, was not something that was an accepted international concept or precept of law, but was an individual or local or municipal type of activity. In other words, it was only permitted under that local, if you will, an exception to the general rule. And I wrote an article in so doing indicating that I thought slavery was both evil and unjust. I became later the president of the Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and actually participated in providing petitions to the Congress after the Constitutional Convention. We had adopted the Constitution to abolish slavery. So, the Revolutionary period. The Declaration of Independence, 1776. My wife had now died. I came back to the colonies and participated in the, if you will, the new government under the Continental Congress. Of course, the Declaration of Independence was one of the most significant documents that was developed out of that period of time, which I was a party to. And I would say this about it. I would say that when it says that all men are created equal, as much as I said I was changing my mind, and did change my mind later, I'm not sure at the time any more than I would say Thomas Jefferson believed truly that, if you will, that all men were created equal. Now that's not to say that the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not mean that that wasn't the fundamental goal of our nation. And obviously, as I've learned since I was able to read about other events later on and other men in the history of this country, one fellow by the name of Abraham Lincoln, for example, who suggested that, of course, there was a new birth of freedom resulted from that document. And that's the point. The point was, at the time, there's clearly, all men were not created equal, nor were intended that all men would be equal. But it's the concept that in the future we would achieve that goal in total. And in fact, so it might even say not only men, but all women and men are created equal. But that was something for our future, not something that we believed at that particular time. Then I went on, if you will, to become the ambassador to France. At that particular point in time, one of the earlier visits to London, I was able to get my son, William, a position as governor of New Jersey, and he unfortunately differed with me, and we went two different ways in the political scheme. He supporting the British and the Tories, if you will, and he was just deposed, if you will, as a result. I went to France to be the ambassador to support the colonies. I took with me William Temple Franklin, his son, my grandson, and Benjamin, or Benny Bach, my daughter's son. And while I was in London, of course, as I said, by this point my wife Deborah had died, and I had many, many friends. I was very successful, I think, in my diplomatic efforts. One time when I was interviewed, the interviewer once said, well, why were you so successful in life? And primarily his reference was, hopefully, to your political and your diplomatic endeavors. And I said, probably the biggest reason was my sense of humor. I digress a bit because I note that a book I read, interesting, it has a 4-letter word in it. And I also was, shall we say, provided some background in your areas of comedy and humor in this country about a fellow some time ago who basically wrote on the comical issue of 4-letter words, one beginning with an F, one beginning with an L. We won't repeat what they, well, love is probably the second one. But of course, my point being, apparently the fellow wrote this book about my dissertation on that issue because of the fact that he thought that we were better able to be, if you will, have freedom of press in that day than we are today, because now it's somehow culturally or politically inappropriate to use this 4-letter word or another 4-letter word that begins with S or whatever. So I just point that out as an interesting concept. It was my sense of humor, I hope, that did help me in that process. And so, while in France, as I said, I met many friends. I met Madame Helvetius. She ran a salon, was very influential in terms of the political connections within France. helped me to gain many friends who also would help me gain influence, not only with the intellectuals in the political realm of France, but even the foreign minister, Charles Valgens. And while I was there, of course, I actually proposed to Madame Helvetius, because I was then, if you will, a widower. But my most closest friend, because of course she turned me down, was none other than Madame Briand, my neighbor. And with that, although I probably forgot something, I think I'd like to just ask Madame Briand to step up a bit and say a few words about my endeavors in France.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup. Je suis très honorée d'être ici aujourd'hui en anglais. Hein? Oui, oui. Pardon. I will speak in English. I will speak in English because I'm guessing most of you are not speaking French in the colonies. It's all right. I will talk to you now about me first. Je m'appelle, my name is Anne-Louise d'Albancourt de Briand. That's a big mouthful. You don't have names like that here. Your names are easy. John Smith, John Adams. Talk about him more later. He was not fun. We like Dr. Franklin. We get into the war, mainly because of Dr. Franklin. The Frenchmen like these things, these three things. Women, hein? D'accord, chercher la femme. To eat the fine food, drink the fine wine. D'accord, oui? And we like wheat. We like humor, Voltaire. We laugh at the world. If you do not laugh, you cry. This is what we like about Dr. Franklin. He's witty, he's urban, he is a Frenchman, really. In an American body, we say we like him. So we say, we think about this. You know, it's because of them. We have our own revolution. I'm not going to talk about that today. That is in our future. He's my neighbor. We meet in the spring, le printemps. The 1777. I like him. We are introduced through a mutual friend. We have a long friendship. We write many letters. I have a husband. He is 24 years older than I am. He is, how you say this, that he is fooling around on the side with a nanny. I know this. It's not unusual for Frenchmen, aristocrat, oui, oui, to have a mistress. But in my own house, what do? I am Catholic. There is no divorce. I am lonely. I have, how you say today, anxiety, depression. I am lonely. I have two daughters. I play the harpsichord. I play many instruments. My daughters, they sing. They play with me. That is not enough. I'm lonely. And so in the spring, the printemps, when all is promised and all is new, I meet Dr. Franklin. I lose my papa when I am très jeune. I miss him all my life. Perhaps that is why I marry a man who is much older than I am. Your Dr. Freud would say daddy issues, yeah? Oui, oui. Be that as it may, we have a friendship that is truly platonic. Agape, platonic, as the Greek would say. We play chess, we have tea. I know he loves Scottish songs. I play the Scottish songs for him. We sing, we have dinner together. You know, one night we have John Adams over to dinner. This man, he is he is obviously crabby. You mean well, but he is too serious. We like him better. They are friends. Perhaps what you say today, frenemies. At any rate, we have many happy hours together. But it is platonic. I call him mon cher papa. I sit on his lap. I play the piano for him. We write letters. I teach him French. He is never great, but he tries. He gets what you say is an E for effort. We write many letters back and forth. And it is what you call perhaps on his side an unrequited love. But we bring each other most happiness. And we do talk about virtue. We talk about philosophy. And I am now no longer lonely. I know he loved me in a way that I do not love him. I understand. It cannot be, and yet he does not give up, but he does not, grab the terrier. He is always polite. And that is what I want you to understand. This man is a gentleman. He is a witty, urbane, good person who believes in something bigger than himself. Liberty, égalité, fraternité. That is eventually where we go with this. He is way ahead of everybody. He is mon cher papa, my friend for many years. He resonates down the ages because who does not love Ben? He's so, how you say today, relatable? Always relatable, always lovable. I say to him, you must love these things, your country and God, but above all, your confessor, moi. Merci beaucoup. Pour vous entendons aujourd'hui. Autrefois, bientôt.
Thank you, my good friend. To come to an end, we must say, of course, that Silas D, there were a number of individuals, of course, who also were designated by the Congress to provide diplomatic services to the French who joined me. Not necessarily to my liking, but there you are, the Congress does what it does. And one of those individuals, of course, that replaced Silas Dean, which I think, by the way, got, if you will, how do you call it in modern times, the short end of the deal by what the Congress thought about what he had done. I think he did a lot. He was replaced by, of course, the famous Adams, as we discussed earlier, as you know. During this period of time, of course, the war progressed. We were able to enter into agreements and treaties with the French that provided not only weapons and clothing and food, but also men and a navy. And without that French aid, I have to say, we probably would have been unsuccessful in our revolution. And then finally, the Battle of Yorktown. Peace, although was not settled until 1783. But in regards to, the idea of having to share, if you will, my diplomatic place with Mr. Franklin, and as why is it that I find that I'm, shall we say, so enamored and so copied and so thought of and maybe so loved? I leave you with this introduction. They used to say that George Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And Franklin was first in everything else. But at the nation's bicentennial, the mass circulating Reader's Digest replaced Washington in the hearts of his countrymen with Ben Franklin, because Franklin represented what Americans liked best about themselves. If Washington was the father of his countrymen, Franklin was their foxy grandpa, the designated humorist that could always rely on for a sharp saying, a merry tale with the magical power to cool the heart and dispel melancholy fumes. Finally, I will end with a comment about a bird. For my own part, I wish the eagle had not been chosen and represent our country. He is a bird of bad moral character. He does not get his living honestly. You may have seen him perched on some dead tree near the river, where, too lazy to fish for himself, he watches the labor of the fishing hawk. And when that diligent bird has at length taken the fish and is bearing it to his nest for the support of his mate and young ones, the eagle pursues him and takes it from him. With all this injustice, he is never in good case, but like those among men who live by sharping and robbing, he is generally poor and often very lousy. Besides, he is a rank coward, a little kingbird, no bigger than a sparrow, attacks him boldly and drives him out of the district. He is therefore by no means a proper emblem for the brave and honest citizen. Indicated maybe by intuition by Madame Brown here, I would read to you a couple of things, and then I'll finish with those. Two of them I want to talk about, and one is a bird, and the other one is this reference over here that I had to correct. One of your modern affectations about. It said, beer is proof God loves us? No, that's not the case. Not at all. That's not what we're talking about. And I will read to you then, if you will. Hopefully I get that right. By means of this liquor, we discovered numberless important truths, so that ever since that time, the word to divine has been in common use, signifying originally to discover by means of wine. My Christian brethren, be kind and benevolent like God, and do not spoil his good work. He made wine to gladden the heart of man. Do not therefore, when at table you see your neighbor pour wine into his glass, be eager to mingle water with it. Why should you drown truth? Do not then offer water except to children. 'Tis a mistaken piece of politeness, and often very inconvenient. Therefore, it's not beer that God made us gladden, but wine. As regards Mr. Adams, we'll end by quoting from one of your more modern historians with regard to myself, and actually two quotes. One, as I'll indicate, as this. As a matter of fact, the French disliked everybody we sent to them at that time, except Franklin. Dean, they tolerated. Izon, they laughed at. Adams, they snubbed. And Lee, they despised as a stupid blunderer who knew no better than to abuse French manners in the presence of his servants, who spread the tale all over Paris. But dear, delightful, philosophic, shrewd, economical, naughty, flirtatious, and anecdotal telling Franklin seemed like one of themselves. And then I leave you with one other comment from a modern again. Why is it that I find that I am, shall we say, so enamored and so copied and so thought of and maybe so loved? I leave you with this introduction. They used to say that George Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And Franklin was first in everything else. But at the nation's bicentennial, the mass circulating Reader's Digest replaced Washington in the hearts of his countrymen with Ben Franklin, because Franklin represented what Americans liked best about themselves. If Washington was the father of his countrymen, Franklin was their foxy grandpa, the designated humorist that could always rely on for a sharp saying, a merry tale with the magical power to cool the heart and dispel melancholy fumes. Finally, I will end with a comment about a bird. For my own part, I wish the eagle had not been chosen to represent our country. He is a bird of bad moral character. He does not get his living honestly. You may have seen him perched on some dead tree near the river, where, too lazy to fish for himself, he watches the labor of the fishing hawk. And when that diligent bird has at length taken a fish and is bearing it to his nest for the support of his mate and young ones, the eagle pursues him and takes it from him. With all this injustice, he is never in good case, but like those among men who live by sharping and robbing, he is generally poor and often very lousy. Besides, a little vain and silly, a bird of courage, and would not hesitate to attack a grenadier of the British Guards who would presume to invade his farmyard with a red coat. And I thank you. We've almost 5 minutes left, assuming we're going to do this for an hour. If you would, if no questions, we'll say bon voyage. What's that?
Qu'est-ce que tu dis?
Yeah,
Bon voyage.
my French was
Déjà
good
American.
enough to understand, but never very good. Well,
Are there any questions?
thank you. Oh, yes.
Here.
Didn't Benjamin Franklin have some connection directly with Mannheim?
Yes. Yes. Your
But I
daughter,
forgot what I read.
Sally.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes, your daughter, Sally.
Yeah.
Were you in the country during that time, or were you in Europe? In the late, what is it, 1776, 7?
Well, let's see, return, you know, years escape my memory because it's very faulty. But obviously, as I said, I was here right after 1775 and 1770. When I left the cockpit, if you will, and the year, again, probably 1775, I forgot to mention, of course, that during that time the Boston Tea Party took place, which only aggravated the situation that I was representing these rebellious colonymen, because I was representing Massachusetts. And in that instance, then I stayed for a year, attempting again to reconcile the colonies with Britain, and found that it was not going to be successful. And so I left, actually with the belief that I may have been arrested at some point if I didn't flee. And of course, my wife at that point had died. So obviously I was here, if you will, for the commencement of the First Continental Congress, involved in writing on the committee for writing the Declaration of Independence, which of course we know is 1776. So, excuse me, for what year she arrived, I don't remember, whatever year it was then.
Well, she came here with Robert Morris. Robert Morris and your son-in-law, or excuse me, Robert Morris and his wife had the Stegall Mansion.
All right.
They bought it after it was shared. Now, what I'd like to know is when you or your character was in Philadelphia, how did you have a relationship with Robert Morris, the financier?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly we knew each other, you know, I would say yes. Because as you said, Robert Morris was an intricate part of the financing of the Revolutionary War, if you will. And so in that sense we were.
As far as your writing, you have no recollection of ever being the man on when your daughter and your son-in-law were here?
No, I don't. And someone once asked me whether we were in some other part of Lancaster County, and I couldn't tell you. I found, my memory doesn't serve that I was there in any of those instances. No.
John Hancock loved manhunt. We know that from writing. And he was also with you in Philadelphia, right?
Yes. Signed the Declaration of Independence.
Right. And Big, well, he was the one that wrote Big, so they knew who he was.
Yes. Well, again, thank you very much for your attention.
We have a question over here.
Oh.
Didn't you write
Poor Richard's
Almanack?
Poor Richard's Almanack? Oh, yes.
Richard's Almanac, yeah, Poor Richard.
Yes, and for a number of years, of course. And the point, of course, is that in many cases, everybody wrote an almanac in the period. Publishers of newspapers, printers, printed almanacs. So I felt I needed an almanac that was different than all others. And that's why I invented Poor Richard as being the one who would be a great contributor, if you will, to that almanac. And we even had debates about myself. I predicted that, you know, a certain individual who was publishing a competitive almanac was going to die on a certain date. And everybody was concerned, waiting for the date, you know, and whatever. And we went back and forth in terms of our discussion with each other about whether or not he was going to die or not going to die, and did he die, and if he didn't die, well, I was wrong. I'll just make another prediction. It made for good reading.